we can dim the lights and just start. So I start my lecture with each story, and whenever I'm giving a lecture, I think, well, will I tell this story this time? And then I think, yeah, I still have to tell this story because it's still meaningful to me. The story is an actual work of fiction by a South American writer whose name was Jorge Luis Borges, and he wrote short stories. He often wrote about himself in the first person, and the title of this story is called The Aleph. Now, if you read it, which I would recommend, you'll realize that I have changed it and made it my own story. So this is just my paraphrasing the story. But at any rate, Borges writes about himself as a young artist in Buenos Aires, and he's a writer and a poet, and he's up and coming. He's a rising star, and he falls in love with a very beautiful woman whose name is Beatrice. She is a socialite, and she's always in the news, and she's not very interested in him. But he becomes obsessed by her, and the more that she ignores him, the more he falls in love with her. She dies tragically, and she dies young, and so every year on the anniversary of her death, Borges meets and has dinner with Beatrice's cousin, whose name, I call him Daniele. Maybe Danieri, but anyway, I call him Daniele. And they have dinner, and Borges wants to find more and more out about what she was like as a young girl, just any tidbit of information, because he is just unable to give up this obsession. Daniele wants to talk about writing and poetry and literature. And Borges sort of thinks of him as kind of not really very serious, but he puts up with him. So after about 15 years, Daniele says to Borges, I have a secret, it's in my basement, and I want to share this secret with you. Go down to the bottom of the stairs and lie there in the dark, and you will see this marvelous thing. And Borges thinks this is really idiotic, but he does it. He humors it, and he does it. He's lying down there in the dark, and you can hear the rats scurrying about, and it's damp, and he's thinking he's getting more and more paranoid. And just as he's about ready to get up and leave, he sees what he says is a kind of tear in the universe. And in that tear, he sees everything that was, everything that is, everything that will be. He sees it all simultaneously. It's like a hologram, but it's more than that. It's just this extraordinary thing. And, of course, he doesn't know what to say. He's just sort of mesmerized by this. And he goes on for pages describing the images that he sees. But finally, he gets up and he runs up the stairs, and Daniele is very excited. And he says, what do you think? What do you think? Isn't this wonderful? Borges doesn't know what to say, and he just runs out and goes home and tries to forget about what he saw. Well, a couple weeks later, Daniele calls and he says that the restaurant next door to his house is expanding, and they're going to tear down this building, they're going to destroy this marvelous thing in the basement, and that Borges has to go to the newspaper and he has to help him and tell about this thing and help him to prevent this loss. Borges thinks about it, and like many artists, when he finds out that somebody else has something that he wants, he's jealous. And so he does nothing. And the Aleph is destroyed, and everything seems to be normal, and Borges seems to be, at the top of his game. And then suddenly Daniele publishes this extraordinary poem in which the universe is recreated. Now, I always think that this is Borges really talking about Dante and his competition with Dante and his desire to create something that is really like this, really pushing through to a whole other place, and his failure to do so. For me, the story has always been like this challenge. Can I do that? Can I push through? Can I make something that is really kind of a tear? Make something that, has never quite been, sort of composed quite like anything else before it. It's still a challenge. It's still something that each time that I go to think up a new idea, and I do think of my work as trying to sort of challenge myself each time, and how can I push this just a little bit further and try something else, try, what's the next thing I'm going to dream up? So that challenge is still there, and probably like Borges, I think, well, I'm not sure that it's happened yet. But in any case, this image is of a man who's living in a world that feels very stable. In his universe, there's the correct horizontals and the verticals, and he's in a kind of harmonious, stable universe where he knows where everything is. And he's managed to open up, push through into this other place. And everything is awry. Everything is sort of at different angles and destabilized and maybe asymmetrical and not exactly the way, what he's used to. And he's kind of like amazed at what he's seeing. This notion for me of starting out with a lot of my early work being sort of at right angles and kind of, in certain ways, stable. And then there's the idea that I've always had of how can I sort of, in fact, destabilize things, sort of disorient, if you were. And so the journey has been disorient, but not, completely, not throw you off into complete chaos. But how can I sort of create something that is asymmetrical, that sort of suggests another composition that is not just the formal sort of cardinal points of the compass. The site at the university is a kind of cardinal point of the compass, I would say, the way it's laid out. And I would also say it has some relationship to classical Greece and the way things are laid out in temple complexes. But in any case, and so what I tried to do, and I'll get to that later in the lecture, is to take that very formal, stable, harmonious, clear kind of Cartesian points and then set something in the center that kind of takes that and makes it like flings it sort of into a kind of outer space that takes that curvilinear formal sort of composition and knocks it into like something else. In any case, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to run through images fairly rapidly. We're all used to being bombarded with images, and so I'm just going to go boom, 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 boom. But I had the privilege of getting to see these observatories in India about a year and a half ago that I looked at in pictures and in books for years and years and years. And so I finally got to Delhi, where there's these observatories that were designed off of navigational little compasses and navigational instruments that were developed in like the 17th and the 18th century. And what they did is they took these little instruments that were used to sight the stars to kind of move to that sailors would use and map makers would use, and they architecturalized these instruments into these large-scale architectural forms, observatories, to look up at the stars. And so it was very, very mathematically precise, and all the engineering and the layout and the architecture. And they did this all so that they could find stars at a certain point and the sun at a certain point and then tell their fortune. So it was a kind of really interesting combination of science and magic. In any case, these structures really deal with sort of this kind of sense of putting things askew so that you're almost like you're out of the normal gravitational space where you know exactly where up and down and left and right and back and forth is, and you're kind of thrown up, sighting the stars to find a whole new kind of spatial relationship. And I've looked at these things. I looked at them in books and drawings for years. Finally got to see them. And it was as marvelous as I thought it was going to be. And I really look at these pieces of architecture as like hundreds of years ahead of their time in terms of the kind of architecture that's now being developed with people like Frank Gehry, and using the technology of computers, the computer design that we now have access to in the engineering, whereas this was done in the 1700s. Years ago, in the mid-1970s, I started out making an exhibition that was an outdoor exhibition with a group of artists outside of New York, but we sort of bussed gallery museum people from New York to this estate in New Jersey, where we had worked all summer long building sited works in the land. And this was an underground piece that I made that was about 20 by 50, a series of tunnels and wells. And what I did is I excavated the site, dug it out. I want those people who worked for me over in the audience to know that I actually did lay these concrete blocks. I learned how to become a mason. But in any case, with a lot of help, student help, but took months and months and months. So we dug this out, and then we built up a series of tunnels and wells, and then we backfilled it. And what I wanted the viewer to do was to see these openings in the landscape, to go down these ladders, and then you move around from light to dark. So on top of the earth, everything looks pretty well organized and clear. And then you go underground and you sort of move around, sort of finding your way. And you kind of have to put together what you saw above ground with the experience that you're having underground. And I wanted, and I'm not going to go through how I arrived at this, but let's say that there were certain ideas that were going on in sculpture and in art at the time, and earth art was happening, and certain ideas in sculpture that suggested that one could make sculpture that actually became architecture, but became what I call non-functional architecture, meaning you wouldn't live in these places, you could have slept here, of course, but it's kind of dank down there. It wasn't the most pleasant, but that you could make spaces purely so that someone could experience space and reflect on it and think about it, rather than just taking it for granted. And so that became a lot of the work that I did in the 70s was all about using architecture as a muse and using it as I would look at a lot of archaeological sites and also indigenous American architecture, and then I would use that as to stimulate ideas that I would make as sort of architectural sculpture. But they were never like practical. It was always impractical. Now, I did a lot of drawing, and I still do, and I went around and I documented all these little shanties because I loved shacks and shanties. And then I did a drawing, and I used to of shacks and shanties, and then I would write stories that would go with these drawings. And I did a whole series of drawings that were about fantasy cities. And I figured if you make a city, then you have to give it a reason to be, so the stories would kind of create why the city existed. And to some degree, I would say that a lot of the work that I did during this period was almost like the kind of thinking and playing and imagining that one does as a child, where you design your playhouse for yourself, or you make these little houses in the sand or whatever, the kinds of things that children do. Only I wasn't a child, I was grown up, but it was, again, like these imagined places. And it was all about the body interacting with the sculpture or the architecture and having an experience, whether it was being underground and feeling the feelings that you have when you're underground, or above ground. In this case, you went underground and then you climbed up these walls and you went from ladder to door to ladder to door, and it was a kind of aerial ballet. This was at a place called Art Park, which was near Niagara Falls. And artists would go there for the summer. They would build a piece of sculpture, and then the next season the sculpture would be removed and another group of artists would come. So this is what it was like to climb up it. And then again, some other drawings. And so I would make these drawings. They were kind of fantasy drawings. And then sometimes I would build a sculpture. This particular set of drawings was sort of stimulated by looking again at indigenous American architecture, granary chutes and coal chutes and concrete factories, and then sort of conflating that with houses, generic houses, and had a story. And then I got to build a couple of these structures. This was built in Japan, and the other one was built in Texas, and then shipped to St. Louis. So it had a kind of, these were all temporary works made in wood, but they looked like one thing on the outside, and then when you got inside, they all had these kind of labyrinthian structures. So you would go up, there were ladders inside these towers, and you would go up and down these ladders and kind of dead end, and then go back the way you came. You never could get inside the central structure. And in this case, you would go through the piece, through little portholes. It would take about 45 minutes to get all the way up and all the way down. So again, it's sort of like I would construct these kind of mazes, and I would construct them on paper, and then I would go build them, and they were temporary works. And at the end of the exhibition or whatever, they would be taken apart. These are other types of drawings I made, and eventually I started thinking about, complex connections, and I was thinking of circuit boards, and then I was also thinking about a circuit board sort of like a simple kind of brain. So that's what this drawing was about. And then let me just, I guess I took out okay. So the art piece that I wanted to show in connection with that, but at any rate, I was also doing gallery shows at the same time, and so the challenge was, how do you, if you're building these big outdoor pieces, then how do you take it inside? And so I built this piece called The Machine That Makes the World, and I thought about it as kind of an institution. I thought about it as a labyrinth. I thought about it as an amusement park. I thought about it as a kind of asylum. As various things, as kind of having a generic structure, and for all of these things. But what happened is you were led through a series of gates, like stockyard, and a guide would take you through these steel gates, and then you would get to the circular section in the back, and the walls were on wheels, so you would get turned into the center of the piece. So you get turned into the labyrinth and then turned back out again. And actually, this is at a museum in the Midwest, I think in Nebraska. So it kind of had a sort of some reference to like stockyards and fences and things. As I was making these pieces, I began to also think about industrial architecture, and that what was interesting to me about industrial architecture, factories and instruments and all of those kinds of things, was that the reason they looked the way they looked was because they had to perform a function. But their look was not just about taste and aesthetics, but about this function, and so they became very complex and very visually exciting to me. So I began to look at a lot of different machines and these are drawings for pieces that I then constructed that were all about machines and the architecture of machinery. And at that point, I started to change from wood to steel and various types of metals and glass and plastic, and my sort of palette of materials became much broader and, for what I would do. This is actually in the garden in the library at the school that I graduated from, Rutgers University. And I began also, I would always have fantasies. I wanted to give these sculptures a reason for being, a function. So the function was how to catch and manufacture ghosts. And so they had an impractical function, but they had a function all the same, so that everything was brought together to create an apparition or a ghost, or to bring something back from the memory, and make it reappear. And in fact, when people were beginning to use machines and instruments and understand a little bit about electricity and magnetism and things like that, they actually did think that they could bring people back from the dead by just zapping them. So I started to interplay this relationship between science and magic. And all these pieces really had that type of interdigitation, let's say. And so in my mind, I was sort of on a broader quest. I wanted to kind of understand what it is, what was the nature of invention, what made people invent things, what's the difference between an invention in art and an invention in technology or in the world. And is it the same kind of impulse, and do they cross over each other from time to time? And so a lot of this work was about that. And in the same way that perhaps those Indian observatories were very mathematically precise and engineering precise, but then they used it for a totally unscientific reason, which was to tell their fortunes. So there was a playing back and forth here with these pieces. And a lot of the work also referenced amusement park architecture. And when I was a child, I grew up near Hershey Park. And I also grew up in around a lot of construction, a lot of big construction. So I was familiar with heavy-duty construction. But in my family, for some reason, I don't know why, but my father loved amusement parks. Now, I don't know whether it was a way of sort of, when the tension got in the family or something, that we'd all go down to Hershey Park, get on the roller coaster, and make ourselves so dizzy that we couldn't fight with each other anymore. I don't know, but it was something we used to do. And that notion of the machine, there you have technology and industry put to the use of simply allowing humans to enter the machine and to enjoy the machine for the thrill of it, and also sort of scaring yourself for the thrill of it, was something that really interested me. And the architecture of the amusement park and the hung and all of that really interested me, and the architecture of circuses. And so there's a lot of different things that come into this work. In this particular case, this was a ring that spun, and it spun in different directions. And so this particular piece, which was built at the University of South Florida, had a lot of moving parts. It was a piece that, again, had a life of maybe 2 or 3 years, and then it was removed. But I was also making a relationship between the stacks in the distance, which were part of the industrial aspects of south of the university, and my piece. And I was trying to engage in a kind of dialogue, a conversation with that. This is one of my favorite pieces. It's very esoteric. It's called A Salutation to the Wonderful Pig of Knowledge. And it came in part from looking at drawing. I saw a manuscript, like an 11th century manuscript of the Burning Paradise. It looked like his head had been bisected, and you could see inside, you could see all these electrical sort of impulses going out into the universe, and he had the sun underneath his wing, and it was just this extraordinary thing. And at that time, I was thinking a lot about going back and looking at the Middle Ages and drawings and manuscripts, and how everybody was always flying and floating, and they had all of these rays coming out of them. And I thought of it as kind of the dream of that they were dreaming if they could fly. They were dreaming if they could invent electricity and dreaming magnetism and dreaming all these things. So it was always trying to combine all of that. And so the pig of knowledge sort of did that. And then he's kind of he's like a big computer, sort of. And his head is that one part with all of that gold. And then he has LEDs coming out of his head. And then another part of them have these rails. And so I was combining all sorts of images. And he moves. And he's also a McCormick Reaper. And at that time, I was really, really reading a lot about invention and how we got from, I was fascinated by the notion of tool making and how you can go from a simple thing like an arrowhead to the computer and what that journey was about and what creativity is about. So, and then here you have it, like, whoa. I mean, to me, this is an image of like, whoa. It's a huge, you can see this in medieval paintings because there's always this big vortex that kind of pulls you up into the sky. And then we make this now for our amusement. And so these are some of the sources that motivate what I do. This is called the Savage Sparkler. All of these pieces were made in the 80s. They were made at universities often. This was made in Plattsburgh. For the university up there. I was invited and I brought a group of people and we worked in their shop for a couple weeks and built this piece that was then exhibited in various museums and things like that. But it belongs to the Hirshhorn and to Plattsburgh. And these rings spun around and I was thinking about cement mixers and I was thinking about reactor vessels and all kinds of things. So a lot of these pieces, all kinds of industrial, technological things. All of these pieces had motors. And, so this is another drawing made in the 80s, and I began to think a lot about different cultures. I was always I sort of looked at art history and different cultures and different periods in time. It's almost like walking into a big delicatessen for me. It was kind of like, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and this, and this. And then I would take all of that and sort of put it in my big mental mixer and see what I could do with it. This is the Kaaba in Mecca. And so I made a drawing of the Kaaba, and I thought of it as a kind of a board game. And I surrounded it with all of these dice and board and this sort of floating kind of shanty house above this sort of spinning vortex. Now the notion of kind of a vortex and all these curvilinear forms, these whirlpool forms, are things that have been part of my work for some time. This piece made in the 90s is an indoor piece. Each one is 10 feet in diameter, and they spin, and they don't just spin around their central axis, but they put themselves up in the air, sort of like one of those amusement park devices where the pan kind of comes up and it goes vertical. And so these two kind of have a sort of dialogue with each other when they spin. And you really have to just put this in a room, and then you can look into the room, but you can't really go into the room when this piece is on. So the piece here, and I'm not going to go on and on and on about all the, I hope that some of the things that I've been saying with talking about my work in general helps to create a sort of a platform for understanding this work. But obviously, I was very interested in curvilinear forms and I've been extremely interested in. I know that chaos is really just another form of order. That chaos really doesn't exist. Once you kind of acknowledge it and analyze it, it's really just complexity in essence. But this notion of making something that is very complex and that suggests that there are many different pathways and that it's not just this kind of clear pathway. this kind of Cartesian sort of way of almost like a Renaissance clarity and destabilizing that Renaissance clarity to suggest the complexity and relativity of a situation is really lies at the basis of this. I think that that notion is one that began at the beginning of the 20th century in Russian constructivist architecture, and is a notion that many architects and scientists have been concerned about, and particularly at this particular moment in time. We know that things are very complex, and that there are many, many different there are many different things impinging at one moment on a situation, and that things are really systems with many different aspects, and that there is not just one simple way of thinking about things, or of analyzing things. So that level of complexity is what kind of drives me. Now, the piece itself is really about, and we spoke about it earlier today, about this notion in part. It has many different formal aspects to it, but also part of the idea was to create something that talked about opportunity and what ideas and knowledge and education for me was all about. And again, I think of education and ideas and as being this exciting, sometimes destabilizing sort of event, a series of events, and that it is not just one single path, but it's this wonderful sort of cacophony of intersecting pathways. And that sometimes, and of course, it's not just one thing that happens to you. You will land on some marvelous thing will happen, and you're like, boom. And then, you get to show it at the Museum of Modern Art. Wow, boom. And then 5 years later, you're climbing downhill again. So, but at any rate, but there is this wonderful excitement about, ideas not being at rest. So that is the motivation in part behind this piece. This actually is a little bit overexposed, I think. So I'm going to just try to run quick through things. This was an early machine piece using the notion of turbines, and again, turbines and propellers and whirlpools, and this sort of mix of energy has, and you can see also in these images references to amusement park architecture, super-duper loopers, and all of that kind of thing. Well, again, that energy of sort of throwing yourself out into space and, kind of throwing the ideas up in the air and seeing where they land and let's try this kind of thing is sort of motivating part of the work. This was an indoor installation that I did in the early 80s. Turbines and Cuisinarts and all that stuff. I mean, I could get lost in my Cuisinart. Maybe I'm not making much with it in terms of food, but I love watching it spin all around. And so these are also the types of images that I might look at and that sort of thrill me. I think that the architecture of these types of structures is extraordinary. And of course, then there's the highway system, and which is just a gigantic amusement park. This was done on East River in New York City. It's a big public art park piece. You can see its references. It's still in process. It was made in the early 90s. If you think you're having a hard time, well, New York City can be very slow from time to time. So this piece was inaugurated in 95, and we're still trying to make a park around it. Things do take time. This is on the waterfront, and but it's still big, bureaucratic, whatever, pushing on through to the other side to develop this area. so that the art is there, but the rest of the development has, is still lagging. This is a GSA work in downtown Baltimore, and the building, I think it's primarily an IRS building. It was kind of a banal facade and in a big plaza, and I actually used diagrams of hummingbirds in flight to construct this work. So I might take some simple thing like just a diagram of birds in flight, and then it becomes a huge, huge sculpture. This is what it looks like at night. And I really wanted, people who go to work here in this office, life, it's kind of tedious. And the people who come here, are often, going to pay their taxes, and they're standing in line, and it's sort of tedious and dull, and, in some cases, an unhappy situation. And so I really wanted to surprise them. It's not what you would expect. You walk into the plaza, and it just looks like, you're just surprised. And so I really intentionally wanted to do that. This is in Nashville, and it's been spoken about a fair amount, I think, but again, I was really playing off the stadium site, the bridges, the industrial park that had been there, and I wanted these two main elements to feel like they had almost fallen from the sky and just landed there, and they were in a kind of dynamic sort of dance with each other, and something was just about to happen, sort of like stop action. The engineering that went into this piece was pretty serious, and it was really like, it went out like a house of cards, and it really had to be balanced just perfectly to get that sort of dynamism. So they're just about to do something, either to connect with each other or, with it. I really wanted to feel like it had fallen from the air and not to be over-engineered. You can see there's the bridge, and there are a series of bridges, and I really like playing off of what's already in the environment sometimes and asking the viewer to look again at the world. Look at the art and then look again at the world. This is a new idea. I make a lot of proposals, many, many, many proposals that don't get built, and I'm not showing all of them, but there's lots of them. This was a new idea that I proposed to the city of Toronto in last fall. They took a pass, but it's really where it was supposed to be sort of a gateway entrance, and it's really where some of my ideas are going. Take this ribbon and then push it even more, and push it, into like unravel it, and then make it go on a journey like a road. Okay, I don't want to go to everything that I've done. So I'll just show you images of things, and then I want to get to, this is Tampa, University of South Florida. After they destroyed my factory, they came back and commissioned a permanent work, which was built in the year 2000. And with works like this, the kinds of complex curvature could not really, it could happen, but it would take years and years to build. So we really imaged this on the computer, and then we flattened the sides, and we were able to dimension it full scale so that all the curves flattened, just like if you were making a dress and you made a pattern for a dress, which enabled the fabricator to build it. This is Kansas City. We began to be very obsessed by this notion of this kind of vortex that would sort of suck you in, and also you could broadcast things out, like a kind of it's waiting, it's a vessel, and it's waiting to be filled. This is the predecessor to the piece that we had here at the university. And again, it's got these kind of whirling forms and another vortex. It was built for a park in Fort Lauderdale. I want to get to this last group. So this was a piece called Waltzing Matilda that I made, I don't know, sometime in the 90s. It's an indoor installation. And I had this fantasy of this sort of spinning, maybe ballerina, but it also sort of looks like a flying saucer. And at the base of the flying saucer, there's this sort of sharp kind of drawing instrument. And what this sort of saucer is trying to do, and it's above this steel frame where there's these patterns. And she, and I usually give my pieces a gender for some reason. So the pig of knowledge was definitely, for some reason, a he, but this is a she. And she is trying to, the patterns that are on this big steel plate are patterns for the minuet. And she is trying to scribe these dance patterns on this sheet of glass below. And it's a notion of, trying to, and she can't really. I mean, she's spinning and she's trying to scratch it and draw it, and it really makes just scribbles. And I was sort of thinking about ice skating, really. But surrounding her are these, and it's got a little performance, and there's somebody who operates this machine, and it's like a drawing machine, really. And surrounding the installation, I did a series of drawings, and I used the starry night, the sort of zodiac, and there are 7 drawings, and each one has a different system. This one are diagrams of wars, and from history, and this one are the dances in history, and these are languages throughout history, and games, and mechanical movements. And the whole idea was to kind of play a dice game with the stars, a marble game with the stars, connect the dots. And I was thinking about those observatories. I was thinking about how people look up at the sky, each culture looks up at the sky, and they imagine themselves by looking up there. It's a place they can't get to, but they re-envision themselves. And it's sort of, I don't know if it pushes us, if it causes progress, but it creates culture, so to speak, this imagining into the sky. And so this was my kind of megalomaniac, as though I could control everything by getting all these systems on the stars. And these are city diagrams. So it was as though if this Waltzing Matilda kind of satellite scratching drawing, she surrounded herself by all of this, and maybe if she could just draw all these things, then she could sort of punch on through to the other side. Then early in my career, I did a series of stationary camera. This is like one of my first pieces ever of looking at clouds and just having the stationary camera just photograph as the clouds move in and out of the frame, and they're kind of constantly in transformation. And I did a series of these just about this kind of transformational process of things just always changing. And so this is a piece I've never done, but I really want to do it. It's kind of like an acrobatic act. There are a series of chairs, and each chair would go up one at a time. And what would happen is after all the chairs were up in the air, there would be a projection on the wall of clouds, and then a hand would come in and sort of make a hand puppet on the clouds. And it would happen like, for each chair would get a sort of formation. And I thought of this as kind of like, again, the way we look up at the sky and we project our fantasies and our dreams and our imagination into it. And the way people sort of also live, and it's kind of like a performance. The chairs go up, and at the end, the chairs go back down, and the lights go out, and then there's a whole new series of ideas and projections. And sort of like the way one makes art and creates ideas and maybe creates inventions as well. So that's it. Thank you.